It was a cold winter afternoon in a small town, where the biting wind carried the scent of lit fireplaces and the distant sound of hurried footsteps. The streets were almost deserted, except for a solitary man walking with his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, trying to shield himself from the cold that seemed to penetrate down to his bones. This man was Lucas, a dedicated and kind-hearted worker, but he bore the weight of a life full of hardships and loneliness. Lucas was known in the town as a reserved man, always polite and kind, but distant. He had lost his wife a few years earlier, and since then, his life felt like a series of gray, purposeless days. His job as a janitor at a small local hospital occupied much of his time, but the nights were long and lonely. Without children or close family, Lucas had grown accustomed to the silence of his home, where memories were his only companions. The town where Lucas lived was surrounded by vast rural areas, with fields stretching as far as the eye could see. The houses were simple, with well-kept gardens, and everyone knew each other by name. However, there was a part of the town that few frequented, an abandoned area where garbage piled up and time seemed to have stopped. It was a forgotten place, avoided by all except for a creature that had found an unlikely shelter there. That creature was a dog. A stray dog with a mottled brown coat, thin and dirty, wandering the streets in search of something to eat. He was known by the residents as Bobby, a name affectionately given by the children when he first appeared months ago. Bobby had no owner but had a gentle soul. He was a survivor, living off the scraps he found and the rare kindnesses some people offered him. In his daily routine, Lucas often saw Bobby on the streets, always keeping a safe distance as if he knew he shouldn't get too close. There was something in the dog's eyes that caught Lucas's attention, a deep sadness, a kind of weariness that he recognized in himself. But like everyone else, Lucas never did more than observe the dog from afar, perhaps out of fear of getting attached, perhaps believing that he had nothing to offer beyond his own loneliness. But that afternoon, something different happened. As Lucas walked down the street, lost in thought, he noticed Bobby standing at the corner, looking directly at him. The dog's eyes were fixed on his, and there was an intensity in that gaze that made Lucas stop in his tracks. Bobby didn't bark, didn't growl. He just watched, as if waiting for something. It was as if the dog knew something Lucas didn't, and it intrigued him. Lucas tried to continue on his way, but Bobby's gaze followed him, and the dog began to move slowly, as if guiding him. There was a silent insistence in the animal's movements, an urgency that Lucas couldn't ignore. Against his own judgment, he decided to follow the dog. There was something about that afternoon that made him believe this was no ordinary encounter. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was just curiosity, but Lucas knew he needed to see where this would lead. And so, Lucas followed Bobby through the town streets, crossing alleys and roads he rarely visited. As they advanced, the houses became more sparse and the landscape changed. Soon, they were in the forgotten part of town, where time had stopped and abandonment was evident on every corner. Lucas began to wonder if this wasn't foolishness, but something in Bobby's behavior prevented him from turning back. Then Bobby stopped in front of an old, partially destroyed building, with broken windows and walls covered in faded graffiti. Next to the building, there was a narrow, dark alley filled with trash. Bobby entered the alley, disappearing for a moment, only to reappear shortly after, barking softly as if calling Lucas to follow him. Lucas hesitated for a moment. The place was grim and reeked of decay, but Bobby's insistence was undeniable. Something was there, something the dog wanted him to see. With a final sigh of hesitation, Lucas entered the alley, his heart racing and his mind filled with questions. Bobby was sitting beside an old, rusty trash can that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. As he approached, Lucas felt a pang of sadness seeing the state of the place. It was a forgotten corner of the world, where everything seemed to have been abandoned. But what he didn't expect was what he was about to find next to that trash can. What Bobby had led Lucas to discover would change his life forever, touching his soul in a way he never imagined possible. Lucas felt the weight of the atmosphere around him as he approached the trash can. The strong smell of decomposition filled the air, and he had to cover his nose with the sleeve of his coat to bear it. Bobby was sitting beside him, his eyes fixed on Lucas, as if expecting a reaction. The man slowly bent down, hesitating before lifting the rusty lid of the can. The metallic sound echoed through the alley, making him shudder. Inside the can, amidst torn bags and leftover food, there was something that immediately caught his attention. It was a small, dirty blanket, partially buried under the trash. Lucas frowned, trying to understand what Bobby wanted to show. Carefully, he pulled the blanket, revealing something that made him recoil in shock: a small, curled-up body, fragile and almost motionless. It was a puppy, so thin and malnourished that its skin seemed to fuse with its bones. Its eyes were closed, and its breathing was so weak that, for a moment, Lucas thought it was no longer alive. Lucas's heart raced, and he felt a wave of despair and sadness wash over him. How could someone be so cruel as to throw such a defenseless creature into the trash, abandoned to its fate? Bobby approached, nudging the small body with his nose, as if pleading for Lucas to do something. It was evident that the stray dog had found the puppy and, having nowhere to take it, did what he could to attract the attention of someone who could help. Lucas felt a lump in his throat, and tears began to form in his eyes. He knew he had to act quickly. With trembling hands, Lucas picked up the puppy, feeling how light and fragile it was. The tiny body barely had the strength to react, but there was a faint whimper indicating it was still fighting to survive. Lucas looked at Bobby, who was now beside him, and felt an immediate connection with the dog. It wasn't just the puppy that Bobby was trying to save. He was trying to save the hope, compassion, and humanity that remained in Lucas. Without a second thought, Lucas wrapped the puppy in the blanket and began to run out of the alley. He knew he needed to find help immediately. The hospital where he worked was relatively close, and although it wasn't specialized in animals, he knew a veterinarian in town who could handle emergencies. Every second counted, and Lucas ran as if the puppy's life depended on it, and indeed, it did. As he ran through the deserted streets, Lucas realized how symbolic this run was. For years, he had been running from his own feelings, from his own pain and loneliness. But now, through a simple act of kindness by a stray dog, he was running to save a life, to give hope to a being that couldn't save itself. It was as if Bobby had brought something to the surface that Lucas had buried long ago: his desire to make a difference, to be needed. When he finally reached the hospital, Lucas could barely breathe. He rushed inside, ignoring the curious looks of the few staff members still on duty. He ran to the reception desk, where one of the nurses, who knew him well, looked with surprise at the small bundle in his arms. "Lucas, what happened? What are you carrying?" she asked, concerned. "I need a vet, quickly," Lucas replied, trying to control the panic in his voice. "It's a puppy. It was abandoned, and it's very weak. Please, help me." The nurse, understanding the urgency of the situation, picked up the phone and quickly called the veterinarian, explaining the emergency. Within minutes, the veterinarian arrived at the hospital, and Lucas guided him to a small treatment room, where he carefully placed the puppy on the table. The veterinarian, a middle-aged man with a calm and experienced demeanor, examined the puppy attentively. He didn't say a word as he performed the preliminary exams, but the expression on his face showed concern. Lucas watched anxiously, feeling powerless, while Bobby, who had followed Lucas to the hospital, sat beside him, as if wanting to offer support. Finally, the veterinarian sighed and looked at Lucas with a serious expression. "He's in bad shape, malnourished, dehydrated, and showing signs of hypothermia. But there's still a chance if we act quickly. I'll do what I can." Lucas nodded, feeling a mix of hope and fear. He didn't know why, but he felt that saving this puppy was crucial, not just for the animal but also for himself. It was as if, by saving this small life, he was saving a part of himself that had been forgotten. Bobby, sitting silently beside him, seemed to understand this better than anyone. As the veterinarian began the treatment, Lucas watched in silence, praying that the little puppy could hold on. He knew the fight would be tough, but he also knew that, at that moment, he was no longer alone. Bobby was by his side, and together, they would do everything they could to make sure this story had a different ending. Time seemed to drag as Lucas and Bobby waited, watching the veterinarian work with precision and care. The puppy, which had seemed on the verge of giving up, began to show small signs of life. Its eyes opened slightly, revealing a cloudy and weak gaze, but it was alive. Lucas felt a wave of hope rise within him, like a flame he hadn't seen in a long time. The veterinarian continued to administer fluids, warming the puppy's body with blankets and carefully monitoring its vital signs. Lucas never took his eyes off the small animal, his heart tight with worry but also full of determination. Bobby, always by his side, seemed to be on vigil, his eyes attentive and concerned, fixed on the puppy as if he were silently praying for it to survive. After what seemed like hours, the veterinarian finally stepped back, wiping the sweat from his brow. He looked at Lucas and smiled slightly, a tired but hopeful smile. "He's a fighter," the veterinarian said, placing a reassuring hand on Lucas's shoulder. "It's still early to say, but he has a chance. We'll keep him under observation for the next few hours, which will be crucial." Lucas let out a deep sigh, feeling a mix of relief and gratitude. He bent down to pet Bobby, who looked at him with those wise, gentle eyes. "We did it, Bobby. Now we just have to wait and hope that he recovers." As the hours passed, Lucas refused to leave the hospital. He sat beside the puppy, speaking softly to it, as if his words could give the small body the strength to keep fighting. Bobby remained by his side, a faithful companion who seemed to understand the importance of the moment. It was as if the three of them were connected by an invisible thread of hope and compassion. As the night wore on, Lucas began to reflect on what had happened. He thought about how that encounter with Bobby had changed the course of his day and perhaps his life. Why had he followed the dog that afternoon? What had led him to make that decision instead of simply continuing on his way? And why did he feel that saving this puppy was so important? These questions swirled in his mind, but one thing was certain. Bobby had brought something to the surface within Lucas, something he had buried deeply after the death of his wife. Maybe it was the will to care, to protect, to care about something or someone again. Or maybe it was the need to find a purpose, something that gave meaning to his lonely days. Lucas knew he was at a turning point. This experience had forced him to confront his own emotions, to open himself again to the possibility of connecting with another being, even if it was a small puppy. And that connection, as simple as it was beginning to heal wounds that he had ignored for too long. As Lucas pondered all of this, the puppy began to move more, its tiny paws trying to stretch under the blanket. Lucas leaned forward, holding his breath as he watched. Slowly, the puppy's eyes fully opened, revealing a curious and frightened look. It let out a small whimper, which sounded like a plea for help and comfort. Tears streamed down Lucas's face. He couldn't explain the depth of his emotions at that moment, but he knew that something inside him had changed forever. He had reconnected with a part of himself that he thought was lost. The part that cared, that loved, that wanted to make a difference. And all of this was thanks to Bobby, the dog who had led him on this journey of self-discovery. The veterinarian returned to the room, smiling as he saw the puppy's progress. "He's responding well, Lucas. He's not out of danger yet, but there's a good chance he'll survive." Lucas nodded, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you for everything." The veterinarian placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder again. "You made the difference, Lucas. This puppy is here today because you chose to act, you chose to care. And that's no small thing." As the veterinarian left the room, Lucas looked at Bobby, who was watching him with an almost human expression of understanding. "You knew what you were doing, didn't you?" Lucas whispered, stroking the dog. "You knew I needed this as much as he did." Bobby wagged his tail slowly, as if confirming Lucas's words. It was as if the dog had been sent to guide Lucas back to the path he had lost, to show him that there was still hope, even in the darkest and most forgotten places. Lucas knew that night marked a new beginning. He was no longer alone, and his heart, which had been closed off, was beginning to open again. All because of a stray dog and an abandoned puppy. Sometimes, the greatest lessons in life come from the most unexpected places. As the days passed, the puppy began to show visible signs of recovery. Under the attentive care of the veterinarian and Lucas's unwavering affection, it slowly began to regain strength. Its eyes, once dull and lifeless, now sparkled with renewed curiosity. The puppy, which Lucas decided to name Lucky in honor of the luck it seemed to have finally found, began to explore the world around it with the energy of a young creature just discovering the beauty of life. Bobby, always by Lucky's side, seemed to take on the role of guardian and mentor. It was a touching scene to see the two dogs together. Bobby, with his street smarts and wise gaze, and Lucky, with his newfound innocence and enthusiasm. They became inseparable, and as Lucas watched them, he felt his heart warm in a way it hadn't in a long time. Lucas himself began to change as well. The mornings were no longer lonely, and the oppressive silence that used to fill his home was replaced by the sound of running paws, playful antics, and joyful barks. Lucky had brought life back into that house, and Lucas now felt inspired to care not only for the puppy but also for Bobby, who had become an integral part of his new family. The neighbors began to notice the change in Lucas. He, who was once seen as a solitary and reserved man, now smiled more, chatted with people, and even invited some friends over to meet his new companions. It was as if the wall Lucas had built around himself was slowly crumbling, brick by brick, allowing light to enter his life once again. One morning, while walking through the city park, Lucas came across a group of children playing. When they saw Bobby and Lucky, they ran over, enchanted by the two dogs. Bobby, who usually kept his distance from humans, surprisingly allowed the children to pet him, while Lucky ran around joyfully, playing fetch. Lucas watched with a smile on his face, feeling a deep gratitude for that moment. It was then that one of the children, a girl with bright eyes, approached Lucas. "Sir, you take such good care of these dogs. They seem so happy." Lucas knelt down to be at the girl's eye level and replied with a gentle smile. "They are my family now. They taught me that even when life seems hard, there's always something or someone that can bring light back." The girl smiled and ran back to play with the dogs. Lucas stood there, watching them, and realized that his life had indeed changed in ways he never imagined possible. The dogs, which had once been just a distraction on his path, were now his reason for waking up each morning with a purpose. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Lucky grew quickly, gaining weight and energy, while Bobby continued to be the loyal and protective companion. Lucas began to take them on daily walks, exploring new parts of the city, including those areas he had once avoided because of painful memories. It was during one of these walks that Lucas decided to visit the alley where he had first found Lucky. It was a place that brought back dark memories, but now, with Bobby and Lucky by his side, he felt it was time to confront that chapter of his life. When they arrived at the alley, Lucas paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. The place was still sad and forgotten, but he no longer felt the same weight in his heart. "You two changed everything," Lucas whispered, looking at the dogs. This place represents a beginning, not an end." Bobby approached Lucas, rubbing his head against Lucas's leg, while Lucky sniffed curiously around. It was as if both dogs were reaffirming Lucas's new perspective, that even in the darkest places, there can always be a chance for a new beginning. Lucas knelt down and stroked Bobby, silently thanking him for what he had done. "You brought me back to life, Bobby. You and Lucky showed me that life is about more than just surviving. It's about finding those who make us feel alive again." Bobby, with his wise eyes, looked at Lucas with an understanding that went beyond words. It was as if he had known from the beginning that this journey would lead them to this moment. Lucky, now a healthy and lively puppy, ran back to Lucas, bringing with him a joy that seemed to fill the air around them. Lucas stood up, feeling an inner peace that he hadn't experienced in years. The alley that once symbolized despair was now a symbol of hope and renewal. With Bobby and Lucky by his side, Lucas knew that the future was full of possibilities and that he was no longer alone to face them. As they walked back home, Lucas reflected on the lessons he had learned. Life, no matter how difficult it may be, always offers a second chance. We just need to be open to receiving it. Bobby and Lucky weren't just stray animals. They were his saviors, his companions, and, above all, the bearers of a powerful message that hope and love can be found in the most unexpected places. And so, Lucas moved forward, no longer as a lonely man, but as someone who had rediscovered the value of life and love, thanks to two dogs who crossed his path when he needed them most. And in the end, he knew that whatever the future held, he was ready to face it with an open heart full of gratitude. Days turned into weeks, and Lucky, the puppy who once struggled for life, was now a ball of energy and joy. He ran around Lucas's feet, who watched with a smile on his face, an expression he hadn't worn in a long time. Lucas's life, once marked by loneliness and sadness, had been revitalized in ways he never thought possible. Bobby, the loyal companion who had started it all, now had a permanent place beside Lucas and Lucky. The three of them formed an inseparable unit, a new family born out of compassion and chance. As Lucas looked at Bobby and Lucky, he felt deep gratitude, not just for finding these unexpected friends, but for rediscovering his ability to love and care. One morning, while they were walking together in the park, Lucas paused for a moment to watch Lucky play with other dogs, while Bobby, ever vigilant, watched from the side. He realized that by following Bobby on that cold day, he had not only saved a life but also found a new purpose for his own. Lucas turned to Bobby, gently stroking the dog's head. "You led me here, my friend, and for that, I'll be forever grateful." Bobby looked up, as if he understood every word. And in that gaze, Lucas found a deep connection, one that transcended words and was woven by the invisible thread of fate and compassion. As they continued to walk through the park, Lucas reflected on how small actions can have a profound impact. A choice, a decision, can change lives. And sometimes, the simplest of creatures, like a stray dog, can be the instrument of significant change. By the end of that day, Lucas knew that their journey was just beginning. With Bobby and Lucky by his side, he was ready to face the future with a renewed heart and a hope he thought he had lost forever. And so, a story that began with an unexpected encounter ended with the promise of new beginnings and a life full of love and purpose. Lucas, Bobby, and Lucky, three souls who found each other at just the right moment, now walked together, proving that love can be found in the most unlikely places and that sometimes it's the small acts of kindness that truly save the world.